The Travelers Series, A Choice Seeker Story, Episode 2, Dark Desire, Part 3. The ringing of the phone on her nightstand startled her, pulling her from her thoughts. Cynthia took a deep breath, trying to push the unsettling memories aside, and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" "Cynthia, it's Catherine," the voice on the other end said, full of its usual energy. Catherine Wharton was the wife of another senator, a woman who was known for her social skills and influence in Washington's political circles. "How are you, dear?" Cynthia forced herself to sound pleasant, though she was still distracted by her thoughts. "I'm fine, Catherine. How are you?" "Oh, I'm doing well, just busy as always," Catherine replied with a light laugh. "Listen, I wanted to let you know that I've just been informed I'll be chairing the committee for the women's efforts in the campaign." Cynthia's heart skipped a beat. She sat up straighter, her grip tightening on the phone. "Chairing?" she repeated, trying to keep her voice steady. "I thought we agreed that I would chair and you would co-chair." There was a brief pause on the other end, just long enough to let Cynthia know that Catherine had anticipated this reaction. "Yes, well, things change, you know how it is," Catherine said breezily. "I spoke with a few people, and it seems they thought it would be best if I took the lead on this. But of course, you'll still be heavily involved. Your contributions are invaluable." Cynthia's blood ran cold as the full meaning of Catherine's words sank in. She had been outmaneuvered, used. Catherine had played her, making her believe they were working together, only to go behind her back and take the position for herself. The betrayal stung more than she wanted to admit. She had trusted Catherine, and now she felt like a fool for letting her guard down. "I see," Cynthia managed to say, though her voice was tight with barely suppressed anger. "Oh, don't be upset, Cynthia," Catherine continued, her tone light and dismissive. "These things happen all the time. It's all part of the game, you know?" Cynthia's hand clenched around the phone, her knuckles white. She felt a surge of bitterness rising within her, a dark, ugly emotion that she could barely contain. She wanted to lash out, to make Catherine feel the sting of betrayal that she was feeling right now. In her heart, she wished something terrible would happen to Catherine, something that would teach her a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. "I have to go," Cynthia said abruptly, cutting off whatever else Catherine had been about to say. "Goodbye." Before Catherine could respond, Cynthia slammed the phone down, her chest heaving with anger. She sat there for a moment, her mind swirling with dark thoughts. She hated how powerless she felt, how easily she had been manipulated. But more than that, she hated Catherine for betraying her trust. "I hope something happens to her," Cynthia thought bitterly. "Something that makes her regret ever crossing me." A few hours later, Cynthia was sitting in the living room, still fuming over the conversation, when the phone rang again. She picked it up, half expecting it to be Catherine calling to gloat further. "Hello," she answered, trying to keep her voice even. "Cynthia, it's Claire!" came the voice of another senator's wife, her tone urgent and panicked. "Have you heard about Catherine?" Cynthia's heart skipped a beat. "No, what happened?" "She's in the hospital," Claire said, her voice trembling. "She overdosed on her own medication. They found her unconscious in her bedroom. She's in intensive care right now, and the doctors aren't sure if she's going to make it." Cynthia's blood ran cold. She gripped the phone so tightly that her hand began to shake. "What?" she whispered, barely able to get the word out. "It's terrible," Claire continued, her voice breaking. "She's been under so much stress lately, but no one expected this. They're saying it was an accident, but who knows?" Cynthia's mind was reeling. Just a few hours ago, she had wished for something bad to happen to Catherine, and now this? It couldn't be a coincidence. It was too much, too soon. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Whatever power she had, it was real, and it was dangerous. I have to go," Cynthia stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. She hung up the phone and sat there in stunned silence, her mind racing. The power she had unleashed had done this. She had wished for something bad to happen, and now Catherine was lying in a hospital bed, fighting for her life. A wave of guilt and fear washed over her. What had she done? And more importantly, what was she becoming? As she began to consider what had just happened, something unknown within her enjoyed and was excited about what just happened. However, Cynthia quickly dismissed this feeling. Chapter 5. A Confession Over Coffee. Cynthia could barely keep her hands steady as she fumbled with her phone, dialing Sade's number. Her mind raced, heart pounding with the weight of what she'd just learned. The news of Catherine's overdose still echoed in her ears, filling her with a mix of fear and guilt. She needed to talk to someone who might understand, but she also knew she had to be careful about what she revealed. The phone rang once before Sade's calm, warm voice came through the line. "Cynthia, darling, how are you? It's been too long." "Sade, I need to see you. Can we meet? Right away?" Cynthia's voice trembled, betraying her inner turmoil. There was a brief pause, and Cynthia could sense the concern in Sade's voice when she responded. "Of course, Cynthia. Where would you like to meet?" "There's a private cafe nearby. I'll send you the address," Cynthia said hurriedly. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Sade replied, her tone gentle but laced with curiosity. Cynthia hung up and quickly grabbed her coat and keys, her mind still reeling. She knew she was walking a fine line. She needed Sade's advice, but she also knew that there were things she couldn't disclose, not even to someone she considered a friend. As Cynthia drove to the cafe, she couldn't help but remember the strange dreams that had plagued her since returning from Nigeria. Dreams of a dark, shadowy figure that visited her at night, its presence both terrifying and intoxicating. The creature would invade her senses, leaving her feeling violated and yet inexplicably aroused. These dreams had stirred desires within her that she had never felt before, desires that frightened her. When she arrived at the cafe, she chose a secluded corner, away from prying eyes. The minutes felt like hours as she waited, her anxiety mounting with each passing second. Finally, Sade arrived, sweeping into the cafe with an air of elegance that turned heads. Sade was impeccably dressed in an expensive tailored suit, the deep burgundy color contrasting beautifully with her smooth, dark skin. A string of pearls adorned her neck, and her designer heels clicked softly against the polished floor as she walked. Sade always exuded sophistication and poise, a woman who had mastered the art of appearing unflappable, no matter the circumstances. As she approached the table, Sade's eyes quickly took in Cynthia's state. "Cynthia, darling, you look as if you've seen a ghost. What's the matter?" Cynthia couldn't keep the tremor out of her voice. "Sade, something's happening to me. Ever since I got back from Nigeria, I've been feeling different." Sade took a seat across from her, reaching out to gently place a hand over Cynthia's. "Take a deep breath, Cynthia. It's all right. Just tell me what's going on." Cynthia hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I'm not sure where to begin. There have been these changes, and I've been having these dreams. They're so vivid, so real. I wake up feeling different, like something is trying to take over me." Sade nodded slowly, her expression serious. "I know what you mean. I've had similar dreams myself, but it's been a long time. 5 years to be exact." Cynthia looked up, startled. 5 years? You mean this started for you right after you had your twins?" Sade's gaze was steady, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something darker, more secretive. "Yes. After the ritual in Nigeria, I began having these dreams just as you described. They were so intense, so consuming. And it wasn't just the dreams. I began to feel things, dark things that I'd never felt before." Cynthia swallowed, her mouth dry. "What kind of things?" Sade leaned back slightly, her eyes scanning the room before she spoke. "Desires. Strong desires, but not for my husband. These feelings were different, more primal, and I gave in to them." Cynthia's breath caught in her throat. "You mean you?" "Yes," Sade said softly, her voice steady. "I had affairs. One of them was with a young banker, handsome, charming, everything I shouldn't have wanted. But I couldn't help myself. It was like I was driven by something beyond my control." Cynthia's mind raced, trying to process what Sade was telling her. She had always admired Sade for her elegance and control, but this revelation shook her. She knew she had to be careful. Sade was clearly dealing with her own demons, and Cynthia couldn't afford to reveal the full extent of what she was experiencing. "Sade," Cynthia began cautiously, Do you think this has something to do with the ritual? That maybe we've been changed in some way?" Sade nodded slowly, her expression grim. "I do. That ritual, it wasn't just about asking for children. It was about making a pact with forces we don't fully understand. Forces that have a cost." Cynthia shivered, her thoughts drifting back to Catherine's overdose. She didn't dare mention it to Sade, not yet. There was too much at stake, and she couldn't be sure how Sade would react. "I've been trying to control it," Sade continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not easy. The desires, the thoughts, they're always there, lurking beneath the surface." Cynthia nodded, though she felt more alone than ever. She was terrified of what was happening to her, but she couldn't bring herself to fully trust Sade. Not when she knew that Sade had her own secrets, her own darkness to contend with. Sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared experiences hanging heavily between them. Finally, Sade spoke again, her tone firm. "Whatever happens, Cynthia, we have to stay strong. We can't let this darkness consume us. We have to fight it, together." Cynthia forced a smile, though her heart wasn't in it. "You're right. We'll get through this." But as they left the cafe and parted ways, Cynthia couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the edge of something dangerous, something that could destroy everything she held dear, and yet something deep in her welcomes it. Chapter 6. Temptation at the Door. As Cynthia drove home from her meeting with Sade, she felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her. The conversation had been both unsettling and strangely comforting. On one hand, knowing that Sade had gone through something similar made her feel less alone. On the other, it reinforced the fact that whatever was happening to her was real and dangerous. She pulled into the driveway, her mind still racing with the revelations of the day. As she stepped out of the car, she decided she needed something to help calm her nerves, to take the edge off the tension that had been building inside her. She headed to the liquor cabinet and pulled out a bottle of her favorite wine, a rich red that she often sipped on during quiet evenings. Settling into her favorite armchair, Cynthia poured herself a glass and took a small sip, savoring the taste as it spread warmth through her body. The wine began to work its magic, loosening the tight knot of anxiety in her chest. She sighed, allowing herself to relax for the first time that day. Her thoughts drifted to the fact that she was now 6 weeks pregnant. Despite everything that had happened, the strange powers, the dark dreams, this was something she had longed for, something that gave her hope. She was going to have a child. A special boy who would finally fill the void that had haunted her since Mark's death. The idea filled her with a cautious optimism, a glimmer of light in the midst of the darkness that had begun to encroach on her life. Just as she was beginning to feel a sense of peace, the doorbell rang, startling her out of her reverie. Cynthia frowned, wondering who it could be. She wasn't expecting anyone, and Rodney wasn't due home for several more hours. Setting her wine glass down, she walked to the door and peered through the peephole. To her surprise, it was Joe, the handyman, standing on the porch, toolbox in hand. Cynthia felt a strange flutter in her chest as she opened the door. "Joe, what are you doing here?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Joe smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Evening, Mrs. Rodney. The senator called me earlier, said there was something that needed fixing in the house." Cynthia blinked, her mind racing to catch up. Rodney hadn't mentioned anything to her, but then again, he often handled these small matters without bothering her. She felt a sudden rush of heat through her body as she looked at Joe. He was standing close, his presence strong and familiar, and she couldn't ignore the way her body responded to him. An almost primal need that she'd been trying to suppress. "Oh, right. Yes, of course," she stammered, trying to regain her composure. "Come in. I'll show you where it is." She led Joe through the house, her mind reeling from the intensity of her feelings. When they reached the living room, she pointed to the ceiling fan, which had been making an odd noise lately. "It's the fan," she said, her voice a little too breathy. "It's been acting up." Joe nodded, setting his toolbox down. "I'll take care of it, Mrs. Rodney. Shouldn't take long." Cynthia watched him for a moment, torn between the urge to stay and the need to distance herself. She could feel the tension building inside her, the same tension she'd been trying so hard to ignore. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to turn away. "I'll be in the kitchen if you need anything," she said, trying to sound casual. Joe nodded, already focused on the task at hand. Cynthia made her way back to the kitchen, grateful for the brief reprieve. She poured herself another glass of wine, hoping it would help calm her nerves. But as she sat at the counter, sipping the wine, her thoughts kept drifting back to Joe. She tried to distract herself, to focus on anything else, but it was no use. The image of Joe, strong and capable, working just a few rooms away, filled her mind. She thought about what Sade had said earlier, that she had given in to her desires, had allowed herself to be consumed by them. The idea both intrigued and terrified Cynthia. After a few minutes, she couldn't resist any longer. She found herself standing by the door, watching Joe as he worked. He was so focused, so unaware of the effect he was having on her. The way his muscles moved under his shirt as he reached up to adjust the fan, the way his hands deftly handled the tools, it was all too much. Cynthia felt a familiar itch between her legs, a desire that had been growing stronger ever since she returned from Nigeria. "Why are you fighting this?" a voice inside her whispered. "You know you want it. You know he wants you." Before she knew it, Cynthia was walking back into the living room, her heart pounding in her chest. Joe looked up as she approached, a smile on his lips. "Everything all right, Mrs. Rodney?" Cynthia nodded, but her voice failed her. She glanced around, her eyes landing on a large, heavy vase on the mantelpiece. "Actually, Joe, there's something else," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That vase. It's too heavy for me to move. Could you?" Joe set his tools down and walked over to the mantelpiece. "Sure thing," he said, reaching out to lift the vase. Cynthia stood close. Too close. She could feel the warmth radiating from his body, the scent of his cologne filling her senses. Her breath quickened as she watched him lift the vase effortlessly, the muscles in his arms tensing with the effort. Without thinking, she reached out, her hand brushing against his arm. The touch was electric, sending a jolt of desire through her. Joe froze, his eyes meeting hers, the vase still in his hands. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the air between them thick with tension. And then it happened. Cynthia leaned in, her lips finding his, her body pressing against him. Joe hesitated for just a second before he dropped the vase back onto the mantel and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. The kiss was intense, filled with all the pent-up emotions and desires that Cynthia had been trying to deny. Joe's hands roamed over her body, his touch igniting a fire within her that she couldn't control. Cynthia responded eagerly, her own hands exploring the contours of his chest, his shoulders, as she lost herself in the moment. It was as if nothing else existed. Just the two of them, caught up in a whirlwind of passion. But then, all of a sudden, a rush of guilt and fear washed over her, and she pulled away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Joe, I can't. We can't do this, she whispered, her voice trembling. Joe looked at her, his own breathing heavy. I'm sorry, Mrs. Rodney, I didn't mean to. I just... No, it's my fault, Cynthia interrupted, shaking her head. I shouldn't have... Just finish your work and go, please. Joe nodded, stepping back, his expression filled with regret. He quickly turned back to the fan, his movements awkward and tense now. Cynthia stood there for a moment, trying to collect herself before turning and walking out of the room. She returned to the kitchen, her hands shaking as she reached for the wine glass. She downed the rest of it in one gulp, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging inside her. What's happening to me? She thought, her mind racing. This isn't who I am. But even as she tried to convince herself, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that it was only a matter of time before she gave in completely.